Andy is the Vice President of Professional and Career Development in Hong Kong CS. And he is also the Regional Director, Technology Innovation in Prudential Corporate Asia. Today, his topic is AI, Data, and ESG. Why 2022 will be the year of AI regulation. Andy, over to you.
Thank you, Kyle, for the introduction. I am Andy Chun. Welcome to my talk on AI, data, and ESG. I've been actually working in AI for quite some time, almost over 30 years, actually. So I've been past pretty much all the ways of AI and seeing it develop and evolve into different stages. So today I want to make a prediction is that this year, 2022, will be the year of AI regulation. And let me explain why. Over the past decade, AI has been developing pretty rapidly. A lot of exciting stuff. There's a lot of R&D, as well, a lot of AI applications that has been deployed and used in pretty much all aspects of our daily lives. And AI starts with data, big data and data analytics, as Chun talked about earlier. People say that data is the new oil, and AI turns that oil into electricity that we can use basically everywhere. Now, over the past decade, AI has been a bit of, people call it the Wild Wild West in US, which is good for research and development. But as we move towards mass use of AI, we need to be more careful. We need to have some guidelines and maybe some regulations. So over the past few years, we saw a lot of AI successes, but there has been problems too. More specifically, problems with AI bias, for example. So what I'll show you is a few examples of AI bias, and some of you probably have seen these examples before. And these are pretty much famous, outstanding examples. The first one is a system developed by Amazon, and Amazon as a company gets thousands and thousands of resumes and CV each day. So they develop an internal AI system that kind of filter through the CVs and resumes to see which one is which is best for a particular job description. And it turns out that through their studies, they found that this AI recruiting tool was biased towards women. And what was happening is that because of historical practices, there were more male developers, maybe, for example. And what the AI system learned was that if they see the word woman in the CV, they gave it lower scores. So Amazon quickly realized the AI bias and then scrapped that tool. Another example is the system called Compass, which is used by US state court systems. And what it does is that before a defendant is sentenced, they use this AI system to figure out what is the likelihood that they will maybe recommit this crime again. And given the background of two similar defendants, exactly similar background, similar track record in terms of their violations, it was found that it always biased towards the black, and indicate that a black defendant was twice as likely to re-offend compared with a white individual. So this is racial bias. Previously was a gender bias. Another example is from MIT study that was done a few years ago, 2018. And what they did is that they looked into close to 200 different face recognition systems. And out of all the systems, practically, they all behave similarly. They found that these face recognition systems, because this is the United States, perform better for light-skinned men. So the error rate for white Caucasian men was 0.8, whereas dark-skinned woman was 34.7 error rate. And this is, of course, due to maybe a lack of data or underrepresentation of facial data that they had in their database. Another example of AI bias was Facebook ad. So the ad serving algorithm was found this is a couple years ago, 2019, was found to discriminate according to gender and race. So example is, for example, if there's an ad for a particular job, like nursing or waitering, it would recommend it to females, whereas jobs for maybe taxi drivers or construction, they would recommend to male. Or maybe if there's an ad for housing in a predominantly white neighborhood, they'll probably show the ad only to white. So this discrimination according to gender and race was a pretty big debate and issue back then, and has since been solved according to Facebook. There was another system that is used in hospital systems in the United States and was used to process 200 million patients. And what the system does is that it recommends whether or not to give extra health care to an individual based on their history. And this system, because of the data they had, always recommended more health services to white individuals compared with Black individuals. And it was because of many reasons. One reason was that Black individuals historically, because of income reasons, they tend to use less healthcare. And this is an example where the attribute selected was not appropriate and tend to come up with a biased opinion for the AI machine learning algorithm. So given that, there's many reasons for AI bias, as we mentioned. Firstly, when the problem was formulated, very often data scientists would formulate the problem based on business needs, rather than looking at a more human-centric or user-centric point of view, understanding what are the real needs of the individual, focusing more on potentially the profit side of a company. And then once you collect the data, you might not have all the data, necessary data. The data set might be under representative of a particular group of people. And hence your algorithm, machine learning algorithm, might not be that accurate for those group of people. And then when you clean the data, when you organize the data, the way you select and organize the data, the attribute you use, it might reflect existing prejudice in humans. So that is another area where bias might have come in. And finally, when you use the data to create the model, how you design the model may have biases towards attributes or objective that you feel is more important. Now, given all that problem of AI bias, what should we do? So it's pretty clear in recent years that we need more guidelines and more standards, and maybe AI regulations. NIST, which is the National Institute of Science and Technology in US, is proposing a standard to reduce risk for bias in artificial intelligence. So they started this effort just the summer last year, where they're consolidating opinion right now. So the standard is not ready yet. But the interesting thing is that they recognize that AI bias, stands for AI bias or stands for reducing AI bias, should cover 3 main areas, even at the pre-design stage. When you first formulate the problem, you need to have AI bias into consideration or how to avoid AI bias. So the standards will cover pre-design as well as the design development. And then of course, the deployment is also important. A lot of things that very often, people or companies might forget. Once you design AI system, you forget about it. You think that's done. But deployment is also very important because once you deploy, the data that you actually collect in real world might be different from the data you use for designing and testing and training your model. So you need to maybe update your model, retrain your model, and maybe update the model that's used in deployment. Now, because of these issues, there are several frameworks for ethical AI over the past year. In just November 2021, we have this ethical guideline from the United Nations. This is UNESCO. And now the UNESCO members, 193 countries, this is the first ever global agreement on something, and this is the ethics of AI. UNESCO identified 4 values and 10 principles. The 4 value is, the first is that AI system has to respect, protect, and promote human dignity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. Second is AI has to allow environment and ecosystem to flourish, ensure diversity and inclusiveness, allowing everyone to live in peace in a just and interconnected society. So out of that, they identified 10 principles. The first is AI has to be proportionally and do no harm. That means you use AI in proportional to the task at hand, and very often not to do any harm to human society or the environment. Safety and security is of course very important. Fairness and non-discrimination. This is no AI bias. AI system has to be sustainable. Well, what that means is that it is not going to consume a lot of energy in coming up with models. Your data system has to be environmental friendly, for example. Of course, privacy and data protection is very important. Human oversight and determination has to be there. So what that means is that you cannot allow AI just to make all its decisions by itself. There must be a human to oversee the operation of AI. And most importantly, AI has to be transparent and explainable. Has to be responsible and accountable. Members have to raise awareness and literacy on AI. And then there's multi-stakeholder and adaptive governance and collaboration. So you can see that these principles are very common across other guidelines in other countries as well. So the focus on AI doing good for human, doing good for society, doing good for the environment, also being fair, transparent, being able to explain itself, human oversight, etc. And all these sounds easy, but each one of these is actually very hard. And in each of these guidelines, there's actually very detailed description step by step on what it means for each of these principles. The World Health Organization also released last year in summer, Ethics and Governance of AI for Health. And the guidelines that they release is follow 6 principles. First is protecting human autonomy. And then second is promoting human well-being and safety and public interests. Third, ensuring transparency, explainability, and intelligibility. Fourth is fostering responsibility and accountability. Fifth, ensuring inclusiveness and equality, promoting AI that is responsive and sustainable. So you can see that the areas and focus and principles are very similar. A lot on being good, doing good, and being transparent, fair, and also being responsible and accountable. EU, the European Commission, also released ethics by design, ethics of use of AI a few months ago in November 2021. It follows 6 principles: respect for human agency, privacy and data governance, fairness, individual, society, and environmental well-being, transparency, accountability, and oversight. If you're interested in these ethics guidelines, each one of them actually expand to pages and pages of description and of how to achieve this and what each one of these mean. So if you're interested, download the guidelines from these various organizations. And how about China? China has a new generation of artificial intelligence ethics code released also a few months ago in September. And in this guideline, this is China's first set of guidelines on AI ethics. And it's interesting, it emphasizes user rights and data control. So this guideline is actually part of its goal to become the global AI leader by 2030. And it emphasize on protecting user rights and preventing risks through humans should have full decision-making power and have the right to choose whether or not to accept AI service. You can exit an interaction with an AI system or discontinue the operation of AI system at any time. So humans has a right to use or not use. An AI system can be controlled such that it could be, it could be shut off if needed. So AI should always be under meaningful human control is of key essence for China's ethics guide. How about Hong Kong? Hong Kong's Office of Privacy Commissioner for Personal Data also released a guideline on ethical development and use of AI a few months ago in August. Hong Kong's guideline is similar to the other ones. It has 7 ethical principles for AI. First is accountability. So any organization that's using AI is responsible for what they do or the outcomes of AI, and be able to produce sound justification for the actions. So you cannot just let AI make a decision and not be able to justify why those decisions are made. Again, human oversight is important. So you see this over and over again. A human is always in the picture. Human oversight. Organizations should ensure appropriate human oversight is in place for the operation of AI. Another principle that you see often is transparency and interpretability, which is explainability. So first of all, transparency. So you have to tell, if you're using AI, your user has to know that, and then you have to be able to explain decisions made by AI. Of course, like any IT system, data privacy is important, and with data privacy, of course, data governance, having an effective data governance system in place is crucial. And particularly for AI, because as the saying goes, garbage in, garbage out. AI machine learning learns from data, so you have to make sure your data is properly collected, is accurate, properly clean, and any bias attributes removed. Fairness. This has to do with avoiding bias and discrimination in use of AI. Beneficial AI. Use AI in ways that minimize harm to stakeholders. Has to be reliable, robust, and secure, of course, if people are relying on AI to make decisions. Now, those are ethical guidelines, but we need to move one step beyond guidelines and have legislations in place. What if an AI system failed to meet these guidelines? What should be done? So in US and other countries, very often they rely on, first of all, existing legislations. For example, avoiding racial discrimination. And this is an example where Facebook was charged for racial discrimination in targeting housing ads to whites instead of blacks, or vice versa. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in US is also fighting against bias in companies' hiring process. So this paper is from December, and it indicated that 83% of US employers now use AI during hiring. And if that's the case, it's very important that these AI systems are not biased to individuals, like the example we gave, where AI system, a hiring system, was biased against women. The Federal Trade Commission had this paper that was released last year, and it's widely quoted in US. The paper is aiming for truth, fairness, and equity in your company's use of AI. And what it pointed out is that there are 3 existing legislations that applies to AI systems. So these are namely Section 5 of the FTC Act. What that means is that it prohibits unfair or deceptive practices and includes the sale use of, for example, racially biased algorithms. There's also the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and this comes in play where AI is used to deny people employment, housing, credit, insurance, or other benefits, and it has to be able to explain, why. Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So it's illegal for company to use bias algorithm resulting in credit discrimination based on race, color, religion, etc., etc. But what's most interesting is that in November of last year, New York City passed probably the first bill that was targeted explicitly to AI systems. So New York City passed this bill that required bias audit of AI hiring tech. So what that means is that if you're using AI in your recruitment system, you have to have an annual bias audit, make sure that it's not biased according to race, gender, religion, etc., etc. So this is probably the first legislation in US that is targeted specifically to an AI system. However, the major one is EU's AI Act, which a lot of people are looking into. EU's AI Act is EU wants to be the hub for trustworthy AI. So AI Act might set the gold standard for trustworthy AI, just like GDPR did for privacy. So this is the world's first attempt to enact a horizontal regulation of AI. What that means is that there's a set of regulation that applies to all AI systems that's going to be used in EU. And what it does is try to balance safety and respect for fundamental rights without stifling AI innovation and growth. And it does this through a risk-based approach. It classifies AI systems into risk categories depending on usage, with compatible levels of responsibility and obligation. So it was first drafted April last year, and that is going through legislative procedures and getting a lot of input. In detail, this is what it looks like. So it divides AI systems according to different risk levels. So we started low level, which is AI system with low or minimal risk, maybe RPA systems that have really low risk profile. There's no obligation, you just use it. Next step is limited risk. These are like chatbots. Again, the technology is pretty stable, well understood, easy to use. And all you need to do is transparent in that you're using these limited risk systems. You just have to let the user know you're talking to a chatbot, not a human. And then the next level is high risk. This is where all the interesting AI systems reside. High risk, but high value. And these are the regulated high risk AI systems. At the top level, where AI systems might violate human rights or provide harm to the environment, it's called unacceptable risk, and you're not allowed to use it. Now, the steps in getting your system approved is, of course, first you develop the system, then you have to go through a checklist to make sure it conforms to all the assessment criteria that EU have identified. Next, once you pass all the checklists, you register the AI system in the EU database, and then you get to use the CE mark on your product. And if you make any substantial changes, you have to go back through this checklist again. So the CE mark and database is important because recently in Hong Kong we have the rapid tests, and a lot of these rapid test boxes have the CE mark, but you cannot find them in the EU database. So this is where the EU database comes into play. So some of the requirements for high-risk AI system includes you must have a risk management system in place that assess and monitors risk levels across the whole workflow of the AI system. You have to make sure your data is accurate, clean, and you have a data governance structure in place. Technical documentation must be there. Record keeping, you have to have a log of all the processing that's done by AI system, so that if needed, if an audit needs to be done, you have a trace of exactly what data you use, what machine learning algorithms you process, how the results are generated. And then AI system has to be transparent, be able to explain its output to user. There must be a human to oversee the operation of AI system. AI system has to be accurate, robust, with cybersecurity. And then you get to use the CE mark once you pass. So this is very exciting. A lot of people are looking into this. And this applies, just like GDPR, it applies to all systems that would be used in EU, regardless of whether or not it was developed in EU. And it's also interesting, if you have an AI system that produces a result outside EU, but the result will be used inside EU, that AI system has to be certified as well. Before I end, I just want a sidetrack on AI and ESG. So we talk a lot about AI and ESG, mostly on how AI could help analyze ESG data, because there's tremendous volume of data in coming up with all these ESG ratings. But what we want to talk about is how AI is now becoming part of ESG rating. This is a study done by Ethos. Ethos is a nonprofit organization from Switzerland. It's the Swiss Foundation for Sustainable Development, and composed of 235 Swiss pension funds and public utility foundations. So what it did is analyze 48 companies within this foundation, and they did 12 interviews and did research on 18 of these companies, and they did a rating on digital responsibility of these companies. And it's interesting, they rated these companies according to 7 principles. One is their state of maturity of digital governance. Second is digital transparency, and how mature are they on data privacy. Interesting is that they also have a principle on responsible AI, whether they're using the system for sensitive activities like surveillance or weapons. Fair social transition, so if AI or other technology is replacing some job role, or are you helping colleagues to transition to other jobs, and then environmental impact, and then they come up with a rating for that. One of the companies that does these rating is Ethics Grade, and the way they do that is they get public information as well as survey information. They analyze according to the governance structure, the public policy of the company, the technical barriers to trust, ethical risks, data privacy, sustainability, and come up with rating. And they do ratings for different companies here. Nestle has a rating of C, so if you're interested, you could take a look at ratings for different companies. Last topic I will cover is this one. Now, in order to make sure that your AI systems are able to pass these ethical guidelines and AI regulations, you really need to have in place ML ops. So these two terms, so we know AI ops, which is AI for IT operations. So we've been doing that. A lot of companies are doing that now. But what's more important or growing important is ML ops. So ML ops is having technology frameworks, infrastructure, and people in place to maintain that machine learning outcome that you deploy. Now, in typical companies, you might have, this is a more traditional model, where you have a dedicated AI team to create prototypes of feasibility studies of AI models. And that's very easy. You create a prototype of AI system, and that takes maybe 1 or 2 people and maybe a few weeks. But taking something that's from research and development and deploy into the real world, there's a lot more work, maybe taking months, from packaging it into containers, scaling out into parallel processes, tuning the performance, instrumenting it so that you can monitor and log, and then automating all these processes. So what's been happening is that there is a disjoint, very similar to what Gwen mentioned about data and knowledge workers. There's a disjoint between AI scientists and DevOps people. And what's more important about AI is that in order to comply to all these regulations, it has to be monitored and continuously improved. So for example, once you're in production, you have to check if the model is still working. You have to check if there's any bias. and then feed that back to the learning so that you can retrain the model and reduce bias. So there's feedback loop and the ability for ops to understand what's going on requires maybe new resources, new processes, and that's called ML ops. And that's important because bias may creep in during the design and production, during data collection, during the data processing, during the algorithm development and deployment. But data changes. So the data you use to test and develop your AI algorithm may be different from the data that you're collecting and using in daily life because environment changes, business circumstance changes. And with those changes, you have to feedback and make adjustments at each of these stages to ensure your AI model is still performing at its intended performance. And the good thing is that there are tools that are becoming available that kind of help you measure whether your AI system is fair. And there's numerous, so I'm just listing a few. IBM has AI Fairness 360, Microsoft has FairLearn, TensorFlow, Google has also a lot of libraries and toolkits. We're not at a stage where you have a framework that automatically determines AI, whether there's AI bias and adjusts for fairness. There's still a lot of manual work. And that's where the challenge of creating an ML ops team comes in. You have to have people that is knowledgeable about data and AI, machine learning, to be able to really ensure your system is fair and non-biased. And just to give an example how these tools work, and this is using the Google MinDef. So if you have two data sets, and they may be performing at different performance. For example, male and female, maybe it's biased towards male, and female is not performing as well. So it uses a MinDef package and ensure that for different categories or slices of data, the performance is similar. Now, this might not work in all cases, but this is an example, one of the tools that companies need to look into to ensure that AI bias is reduced or minimized as much as possible. Okay, let me end with this this picture here. So imagine you're flying an airplane. You're in autopilot, and this super autopilot intelligent AI system says hey, trust me, everything's going fine. I'll take you to your destination. How likely would pilots trust that this autopilot is working perfectly? Even if it is working perfectly initially, there's many factors. The wind, or maybe there's equipment might have deteriorated. And this is very similar to what AI systems are now. AI systems say, okay, give me data, here's the output. And very often it's much of a black box. There's no instrumentation. You don't know what's going on. You cannot explain the adjustments that AI is doing. And what we really need to achieve is this state, where we have a clear understanding of where we're going, what are all the factors, the wind, altitude, and so forth, reasons for adjustment that's made by the autopilot, and then most importantly, have human oversight to be able to take over if needed. Of course, there's logging in the flight recorder, and ironically, the flight recorder is called the black box, which is funny. But this is so hopefully, if you don't remember anything, remember at least this picture in mind. This is where we want our AI system to be able to have a clear understanding of what it's doing, and for human to be able to understand why decisions are made and with what data. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the talk.